So here's something to think about as you settle in tonight. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow down a little. And just notice, for a second, what's happening right now. Right now, in this very moment, something is occurring inside your head that no one on earth can fully explain. You're aware. You're experiencing things. There's a feeling of what it's like to be you, lying wherever you are, hearing these words, maybe feeling the weight of a blanket, maybe noticing the temperature of the air on your skin. There's something it is like to be you right now. And that something, that inner experience, that private theater of sensation and thought and feeling, is, without exaggeration, the deepest unsolved mystery in all of science. It's called consciousness. And tonight, we're going to talk about why it's so staggeringly, almost absurdly, confusing. Because here's the thing. We live in an age where we can detect gravitational waves from two black holes colliding 1 billion light-years away. We can sequence the entire human genome in a matter of hours. We can build machines that beat the best humans at chess and Go and protein folding. We've landed robots on Mars and peered back to the edge of the observable universe. But ask a neuroscientist or a philosopher or anyone to explain why you have subjective experience, why there's an inner life happening behind your eyes, why it feels like something to taste coffee or see the color red or stub your toe, and you get a very honest, slightly embarrassed silence. We don't know. Not really. Not even close. After centuries of thinking about it, decades of scanning brains and running experiments and writing papers, we still don't have a satisfying answer to the most basic question you could ask about your own existence. Why is there something it's like to be me? And that's what makes consciousness different from almost every other scientific puzzle. With most hard problems, we at least know what kind of answer we're looking for. With gravity, we knew we needed equations that described how masses attract each other, and Newton gave us those, and then Einstein refined them. With disease, we knew we needed to find the organisms or mechanisms causing illness, and germ theory gave us that framework. Even with quantum physics, as strange as it is, we have a mathematical formalism that predicts experimental results with astonishing precision. We may argue about what the math means, but the math itself works. With consciousness, we don't even know what a successful theory would look like. We're not just missing the answer. In some deep sense, we're not even sure what the question is. So let's start at the beginning. And by beginning, I don't mean the beginning of neuroscience or brain scanning or any of that modern stuff. I mean the very first moment anyone sat down and tried to figure out what this weird inner life of ours actually is. And that takes us back a very long way, thousands of years, in fact, to a time when the questions were just as sharp, even if the tools to investigate them were entirely different. Ancient humans obviously knew they were conscious, in the sense that they experienced the world. But the question of what that experience is, what its nature is, how it relates to the physical body, that's a philosophical question, and it starts showing up in some of the earliest intellectual traditions we have. In ancient India, the Upanishads, written somewhere between 800 and 200 BCE, contain some remarkably sophisticated thinking about consciousness. They use the term Atman to refer to the inner self, the experiencing subject, and they explore the idea that this inner awareness might be the most fundamental thing in the universe, that consciousness isn't produced by the world, but is in some sense the ground from which the world arises. That's a radical idea, and it's one that hasn't gone away. We'll come back to it. In ancient Greece, the conversation took a different turn. The Greeks were wrestling with the same questions, but from a different angle. They were more interested in the relationship between the mind and the body, between the soul and the flesh, and they didn't agree with each other at all. Which is, honestly, One of the things that makes the Greeks so refreshing. They argued about everything, vigorously, and their disagreements about consciousness foreshadow almost every debate we're still having today. Plato, writing around 380 BCE, was a dualist. He believed the soul was a separate, non-physical thing that existed before the body and would survive after it. The body was a kind of temporary vessel, and the soul was the real you, the thinking, experiencing part. His student Aristotle took a different view. For Aristotle, the soul wasn't a separate substance floating around inside the body. It was more like the form or function of the body, the way the body was organized. A dead body has all the same physical parts as a living one, but it doesn't have a soul, because the soul is the activity of being alive. It's a subtle distinction, and depending on how you read Aristotle, you can make him sound like a modern functionalist, or a vitalist, or something in between. But the point is, even in ancient Greece, the basic tension was already there. Is the mind a thing separate from the body? Or is it what the body does? That tension would smolder for almost 2,000 years before someone came along and sharpened it into a crisis. And that someone, as you might guess, was René Descartes. Now, Descartes is one of those figures who gets reduced to a single quote so often that people forget how genuinely brilliant and strange his thinking was. He was born in 1596 in La Haye-en-Touraine, France, into a family of minor nobility. His mother died when he was just a year old, and he was raised by his grandmother and then sent to a Jesuit college, where he proved to be an exceptional student, quiet, sickly, and given special permission to stay in bed in the mornings rather than attend early prayers, a habit he kept for the rest of his life. He studied law to please his father, traveled around Europe as a young man, served briefly as a soldier in the 30 Years' War, and reportedly had a series of vivid dreams on the night of November 10, 1619, in a heated room in southern Germany, that he interpreted as a divine calling to pursue a new philosophical method. He then settled into a life of relentless intellectual inquiry. He wanted to put all of knowledge on a firm foundation, and his method was radical. He would doubt everything, everything he'd ever been taught, everything his senses told him, everything that could possibly be false. He would strip it all away and see if anything was left standing. And here's what he found. He could doubt that the external world existed. Maybe it was all a dream. He could doubt that his body existed. Maybe an evil demon was feeding him false sensations. But there was one thing he couldn't doubt, the fact that he was doubting. The very act of thinking proved that something was doing the thinking. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And what that something was, Descartes argued, was a mind, a thinking thing, a res cogitans, fundamentally different from the physical, extended, space-occupying stuff of the material world, the res extensa. This is Cartesian dualism, and it's one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy. Mind and body are two completely different kinds of substance. The body is physical. It obeys the laws of mechanics. It takes up space. It can be weighed and measured. The mind is non-physical. It thinks, it feels, it experiences, but it has no size, no shape, no location. And somehow, these two utterly different things interact. When you decide to raise your arm, your non-physical mind somehow causes your physical arm to move. When a thorn pricks your finger, the physical event in your flesh somehow produces a non-physical experience of pain in your mind. And this is where Descartes ran into a problem that honestly, nobody has ever satisfactorily solved. If mind and body are totally different kinds of stuff, how do they interact? Where does the interaction happen? Descartes somewhat desperately, suggested the pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain that happened to be unpaired, meaning there's only one of it rather than a left-right pair. He thought maybe this was the seat of the soul, the place where the non-physical mind reached across and nudged the physical brain. But that doesn't actually solve anything. How does a non-physical thing nudge a physical thing? What's the mechanism? You can't answer that question without either making the mind a little bit physical or making the body a little bit mental, and either way, you've undermined the whole point of dualism. This is called the interaction problem, and it's been plaguing dualism for over 300 years. And yet, and here's what's fascinating, most ordinary people, when you ask them, are intuitive dualists. They feel, strongly, that their mind is something separate from their body, that the real them is something inside their head, looking out through their eyes, piloting their body like a driver piloting a car. That feeling is so strong, so persistent, so universal across cultures, that it's worth asking, why? Why do we feel this way? Is it because dualism is actually true? Or is it because our brains are wired in a way that creates an illusion of separateness? That question, whether consciousness is genuinely non-physical or whether it's something the brain produces, something physical through and through, is the fault line that runs beneath the entire history of consciousness research. And by the 19th century, as science began to mature and technology improved, people started trying to approach it from the other side, not from the armchair of the philosopher, but from the laboratory. They started looking at actual brains. And what they found was both thrilling and deeply frustrating. Because the brain turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience turned out to be far more mysterious than anyone had hoped. The first serious attempts to connect the physical brain to the mind involved a practice that seems almost comically misguided now, but was taken very seriously at the time, and it was called phrenology. And its story is worth telling, because it illustrates something important about the history of consciousness science, namely, how easy it is to confuse a confident theory with a correct one. Phrenology was the brainchild of a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall, working in Vienna around the turn of the 19th century. Gall's basic idea wasn't crazy. He proposed that different mental functions are localized in different parts of the brain, that the brain isn't one uniform lump doing one undifferentiated thing, but a collection of specialized organs, each responsible for a different mental faculty. That's actually correct, broadly speaking. Modern neuroscience agrees that different brain regions are specialized for different tasks: vision in the back, motor control along a strip near the top, language processing typically in the left hemisphere. Gall was ahead of his time on that basic insight. Where he went spectacularly wrong was in how he thought you could detect those specializations. Gall believed that if a particular mental faculty was highly developed in a person, the corresponding region of the brain would be larger, and that enlargement would produce a bump on the skull. So you could read someone's character, their personality, their intellectual strengths and weaknesses, by feeling the bumps on their head. He came up with a detailed map, dozens of specific regions, each corresponding to a specific trait. There was a bump for combativeness, a bump for benevolence, a bump for the sense of wonder, a bump for musical talent. And for a few decades, phrenology was wildly popular. Practitioners set up offices. People came to have their heads read the way they might visit a fortune teller. Queen Victoria had her children's heads examined by a phrenologist. It was taken seriously by otherwise intelligent people, but it was wrong. The shape of your skull doesn't tell you anything about the shape of your brain underneath, and even if it did, the neat one-to-one mapping between brain regions and personality traits that Gall proposed doesn't hold up. Phrenology gradually fell apart under scientific scrutiny, and by the mid-19th century, serious scientists had largely abandoned it. But here's the thing. The underlying question was the right question. Where, in this lump of biological tissue inside your head, does the mind live? That's the question that matters. Phrenology just had terrible methods for answering it. The person who really started answering it properly, the person who arguably did more than anyone in the 19th century to reveal the actual structure of the brain, was a Spanish scientist named Santiago Ramón y Cajal. And his story is one of the most beautiful in all of science, because it's a story about seeing. Cajal was born in 1852 in a small town in Navarre, in northern Spain. His father was a surgeon, strict and determined that Santiago would follow him into medicine. But the young Cajal was an artist. He loved drawing. He was obsessed with capturing the visual world, and his father considered this a waste of time. There are stories of his father destroying his drawings, confiscating his art supplies, even apprenticing him to a cobbler and a barber to try to beat the artistic impulse out of him. None of it worked. And eventually, grudgingly, Cajal went to medical school. And something remarkable happened. He discovered that you could combine art and science. You could look at biological tissue under a microscope and draw what you saw. And when he turned his attention to the brain, he found a world of extraordinary, intricate beauty, waiting to be illustrated. In the 1880s, Cajal adopted and improved a staining technique developed by the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi. The method, called the Golgi stain, used silver chromate to dye individual nerve cells a deep black against a clear background. And here's what's almost miraculous about it. For reasons nobody fully understands, the stain only works on a tiny random fraction of the cells in any given sample. Maybe 1 or 2% of the neurons in a slice of brain tissue get stained. The rest remain invisible. And that turned out to be the technique's greatest strength, because if every neuron were stained, you'd see nothing but an incomprehensible tangle. The brain has something like 86 billion neurons, each one with thousands of connections. Staining all of them would be like trying to trace a single thread through a ball of yarn as big as a house. But staining just a few, that lets you see individual cells in all their gorgeous complexity. Their long branching arms reaching out in every direction, their delicate tree-like dendrites, their long axons stretching away to make contact with distant cells. And what Cajal saw painstakingly, over years and years of work, drawing with exquisite care, his illustrations of neurons are still used in textbooks today, and they're as much art as science. These intricate ink drawings of cells that look like winter trees, or river deltas, or lightning frozen in place. What he saw was something that Golgi himself hadn't accepted. Cajal demonstrated that the brain is made of discrete, individual cells, neurons, that are physically separate from each other. They come close, incredibly close, but they don't actually fuse. There are tiny gaps between them, gaps we now call synapses. Golgi believed the nervous system was a continuous network, one big connected web, like a fishing net. This was called reticular theory. Cajal proved him wrong. The brain is a network, yes, but a network of individual units, each one its own little biological entity, communicating with its neighbors across those tiny synaptic gaps by passing chemical and electrical signals. This was huge. This is the neuron doctrine, and it's the foundation of everything we know about how the brain works. And there's a wonderful irony in how the story played out. In 1906, both Cajal and Golgi shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. They were honored together, at the same ceremony, for their work on the structure of the nervous system. And at the ceremony, Golgi used his Nobel lecture to attack Cahal's neuron doctrine and defend his own reticular theory. He simply wouldn't accept it. Cahal sat in the audience and listened. He was right, Golgi was wrong, and they both got the prize. Science is like that sometimes. But here's the thing that matters for our story. Cahal revealed the cellular architecture of the brain. He showed us the building blocks, and that was an extraordinary achievement. But knowing that the brain is made of billions of individual neurons passing signals to each other doesn't, by itself, tell you how consciousness arises. It's like knowing that a computer is made of transistors. True, essential, but a long way from explaining how those transistors give rise to a web browser or a video game. You've described the hardware. You haven't explained the software. And you certainly haven't explained the user, the experiencing subject, the person staring at the screen. And this gap, this yawning chasm between the physical description of the brain and the subjective experience it somehow produces, would haunt neuroscience for the next century and more. In fact, it still haunts it. We've gotten much better at describing the hardware. We've mapped brain regions. We've traced neural circuits. We've watched neurons fire in real time. But the question of how all that electrochemical activity becomes your inner experience of the world, that remains almost as mysterious as it was in Cahal's day. Meanwhile, as the anatomists and physiologists were peering at brain tissue under microscopes, a completely different approach to the mind was developing. And this one came not from medicine, but from philosophy and psychology. In 1890, an American psychologist and philosopher named William James published a monumental book called The Principles of Psychology. James was the brother of the novelist Henry James, the son of an eccentric and wealthy theologian, and one of the most original thinkers America has ever produced. He'd trained as a physician but never practiced, suffered from depression and existential crises as a young man, and gradually found his way into psychology, which barely existed as a discipline when he started. He built the first psychology laboratory in the United States at Harvard. The Principles of Psychology took him 12 years to write. He called it his loathsome book during the writing process, and it's one of those rare works that was influential in almost every direction at once. And one of its most famous contributions was a phrase that's become so embedded in our language that we forget where it came from: the stream of consciousness. James argued that consciousness isn't a thing. It's not a substance, not an object you can point to. It's a process. It flows. It moves. It's constantly changing, constantly shifting, even when you feel like you're thinking about one thing, and beneath that surface stability, there's this rushing, tumbling, never-repeating river of sensation and thought and memory and feeling. James was trying to capture something that's actually very hard to describe, what consciousness actually feels like from the inside. Not what it is, philosophically, not where it lives, anatomically, but what it's like, phenomenologically. And if you pay attention to your own mind right now, as you're lying there listening, you can notice what James was talking about. Your attention drifts. A word triggers a memory, which triggers a feeling, which triggers another thought, which fades back into awareness of the sound of these words. There's no sharp edges to it. It doesn't come in discrete packets. It flows. One moment melts into the next. And yet there's a continuity to it, a sense that it's all happening to you, that there's a single experiencer at the center of all this flowing, shifting experience. James also made a distinction that would turn out to be incredibly important, even though it would be largely ignored for decades. He distinguished between what he called the I and the me. The me is the self you can think about. Your personality, your memories, your body, your social identity. It's the self as an object of thought. But the I is the self that does the thinking, the experiencer, the knower. And James admitted that the I was deeply puzzling. You can think about your me. You can reflect on your memories, consider your personality. But can you think about your I? Can the experiencer experience itself? It's like trying to see the I that's doing the seeing. There's something slippery about it, something that always retreats just beyond the reach of introspection. Now, here's where the history takes a strange turn. Just as people like James were developing these rich, nuanced accounts of conscious experience, a movement was gathering force in psychology that would essentially try to banish consciousness from scientific study altogether. And this movement would dominate psychology for the better part of 50 years, pushing the study of consciousness so far underground that serious scientists were afraid to even mention the word. The movement was called behaviorism, and its founding figure was an American psychologist named John Broadus Watson, and in 1913 he published a manifesto that was, in its own way, just as radical as anything Descartes had written, just in the opposite direction. Watson declared that consciousness was not a suitable subject for scientific study. You can't measure it. You can't observe it in someone else. You can't verify anyone's reports about their inner experience. When someone tells you they're seeing red, or feeling happy, or thinking about their childhood, you have no way to check. All you can actually observe, objectively and reliably, is behavior, inputs and outputs, stimuli and responses. So that, Watson argued, is what psychology should study. Not the mind, not experience, not consciousness, just behavior. And look, there's a certain logic to this. Watson was reacting against a real problem. The dominant method in psychology at the time was introspection. Trained subjects would carefully observe and report their own mental states, and psychologists would try to build theories from those reports. But introspection is unreliable. Different subjects reported different things. Different laboratories got different results. It was a mess. Watson wanted psychology to be a real science, as rigorous as physics or chemistry, and he thought the only way to do that was to throw out everything you couldn't objectively measure. And consciousness, by definition, is subjective. You can't measure my experience. Only I have access to it. So out it went. Behaviorism dominated American psychology for decades. B.F. Skinner, its most famous champion, took it even further. Skinner argued that not only should psychology ignore consciousness, but that mental states, thoughts, feelings, desires, beliefs, were essentially irrelevant to understanding behavior. What mattered was reinforcement. An organism does something, it gets a reward or a punishment, and that shapes its future behavior. You don't need to invoke inner experience to explain why a rat presses a lever or why a child learns to say please. It's all stimulus and response, reward and punishment, input and output. The black box of the mind could stay shut. Now, Skinner was brilliant, and many of his insights about learning and reinforcement were genuinely important. They still are, but the idea that you can understand human beings without ever talking about consciousness, without ever acknowledging that there's something it's like to be a person that turned out to be a dead end, and the revolution that overturned behaviorism came from a direction nobody expected. It came from linguistics. In 1959, a young linguist at MIT named Noam Chomsky published a devastating review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. Chomsky argued that Skinner's framework simply couldn't explain human language. Children don't learn language just by being reinforced for correct utterances. They produce sentences they've never heard before. They grasp grammatical rules that no one explicitly teaches them. They make creative errors, saying, "I good to the store," instead of "I went," that show they're applying rules, not just repeating rewarded phrases. There has to be something happening inside the black box. There have to be internal representations, mental structures, computational processes. The mind isn't just a relay station between stimulus and response. It's doing something in between, and you have to talk about what it's doing if you want to understand behavior. This was the cognitive revolution, and it happened in the 1950s and 1960s, and it completely transformed psychology. Suddenly, it was okay to talk about mental representations again, about memory, attention, perception, thinking, about the internal workings of the mind. Cognitive science was born, an interdisciplinary field drawing on psychology, linguistics, computer science, neuroscience, and philosophy. And you might think this would have immediately brought consciousness back into the scientific conversation. But here's the thing. It didn't. Not right away. The cognitive revolution brought back the mind, but it brought back a very particular version of the mind, a computational mind, a mind that processes information, that takes in data and transforms it and produces outputs. And you can study information processing without ever mentioning consciousness. You can talk about attention without talking about what attention feels like. You can study memory without explaining why remembering something comes with a qualitative experience of the past. The cognitive revolution opened the black box, but what it found inside looked more like a computer than like a person, and so consciousness remained on the margins for a while longer. It was still considered a little disreputable in many scientific circles, a problem for philosophers, not for serious empirical researchers. There was even a term for this avoidance. Some people called consciousness the C word in neuroscience meetings, because mentioning it could get you funny looks. But the evidence that consciousness was real, that it mattered, that it couldn't be swept under the rug, that evidence kept piling up. And some of the most striking evidence came from a series of extraordinary experiments that began in the early 1960s. Experiments that revealed something genuinely shocking about the relationship between the brain and the conscious mind. These were the split brain experiments, and they changed everything. Here's the background. Your brain has two hemispheres, left and right, and they're connected by a thick bundle of about 200 million nerve fibers, called the corpus callosum. This is the main highway between the two halves of your brain, and under normal circumstances, information flows freely across it. Your left hemisphere knows what your right hemisphere is doing, and vice versa. But in the 1940s and 1950s, surgeons discovered that cutting the corpus callosum could help patients with severe, intractable epilepsy. Epilepsy involves abnormal electrical activity spreading through the brain, and if you sever the connection between the hemispheres, you can prevent seizures from spreading from one side to the other. It was a drastic procedure, a last resort, but for some patients, it was the only thing that worked. Now, after the surgery, these patients seemed surprisingly normal. They walked, talked, went about their daily lives, and if you didn't know, they'd had their brain split in half. You probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. But when a neuroscientist named Roger Sperry and his graduate student Michael Gazzaniga started testing them carefully, they found something extraordinary. Here's the key fact you need to know. In most people, language is processed primarily in the left hemisphere. And because of the way the brain is wired, each hemisphere receives visual information from the opposite side of the visual field. Your left hemisphere sees what's on the right side of your visual field, and your right hemisphere sees what's on the left. Normally, because the corpus callosum is intact, both hemispheres share everything instantly. But in a split brain patient, each hemisphere is on its own. So here's what Sperry and Gazzaniga did. They had a patient sit in front of a screen and fixate on a central point. Then they'd flash a word or an image to one side of that fixation point, so that only one hemisphere saw it. If they flashed the word apple to the right visual field, the left hemisphere saw it, and the patient could easily say the word out loud. No surprise. The left hemisphere saw the word, and the left hemisphere controls speech. But if they flashed the word apple to the left visual field, so that only the right hemisphere saw it, something strange happened. The patient would say they didn't see anything. They would verbally report that the screen was blank, because the left hemisphere, the one that can talk, genuinely didn't see it. But here's the wild part. The right hemisphere did see it, and if you asked the patient to reach behind a curtain with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, and pick out the object that matched the word, they could do it. Their left hand would rummage around and pick up the apple. Meanwhile, their mouth would be saying, "I didn't see anything. I don't know why I picked that up." The left hemisphere, the talking hemisphere, had no idea what the right hemisphere was doing, and it would confabulate, make up a plausible-sounding explanation for the behavior it couldn't actually explain. Think about what that means for a second. There are, in some sense, two separate streams of awareness in these patients. The right hemisphere is having experiences. It's seeing things, recognizing objects, guiding the hand. But it can't speak, so those experiences are locked away, invisible to the verbal self. And the verbal self, the left hemisphere, doesn't know they exist. It doesn't feel incomplete. It doesn't sense a gap. It just smoothly generates explanations for things it doesn't understand, and it believes those explanations. Gazzaniga would later call this the interpreter, the left hemisphere's tendency to create coherent narratives, to explain what's happening, even when it doesn't have the real information. And this finding has enormous implications for consciousness. It suggests that our sense of being a single, unified conscious self might be, at least partly, a construction, a story the brain tells itself. When the two hemispheres can communicate, the story is consistent and coherent, and you feel like one person. When they can't, you get two separate centers of awareness, each with its own experiences, its own perceptions, its own responses to the world. Does a split-brain patient have one consciousness or two? That question is still debated. Sperry himself, who won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for this work, argued that the surgery really did create two separate conscious entities within one skull. Each hemisphere, he said, has its own separate chain of memories that are rendered inaccessible to the recall processes of the other. Two minds in one head. Gazzaniga, his student, has pushed back on that interpretation over the years, arguing that consciousness is more unified than the dramatic demonstrations suggest, that the right hemisphere's abilities are more limited than they appear. The debate continues. But regardless of where you come down on the details, the split-brain experiments blew a hole in our naive assumptions about consciousness. They showed that consciousness isn't some indivisible, unitary thing sitting at the top of the brain, like a king on a throne. It's more distributed, more modular, more dependent on specific neural connections than anyone had imagined. And they raised a question that would become increasingly urgent as the science progressed. What, exactly, are the minimum requirements for consciousness? What does a physical system need to have or need to do in order for there to be something it's like to be that system? That question, the question of what makes something conscious, is the question that would come to define the field. And in the early 1990s, two developments happened almost simultaneously that finally, decisively, brought consciousness from the fringes of science to its center. One was a book by a young philosopher. The other was a collaboration between a Nobel Prize-winning biologist and a young neuroscientist who'd already spent years obsessing over the problem. And together, these two developments would frame the modern science of consciousness in a way that still shapes the conversation today. Let's start with the philosopher, because his contribution is one of those rare ideas that fundamentally reframes how everyone thinks about a problem. His name is David Chalmers, and in 1994, at a small conference in Tucson, Arizona, the first major academic conference dedicated specifically to the science of consciousness, organized by an anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff, who we'll hear more about later. Chalmers presented a paper that would become one of the most cited, most discussed, and most argued about contributions to the philosophy of mind in the last century. Chalmers was young, Australian, with a mane of curly hair and a rock musician's affect that made him stand out in a crowd of tweed-wearing academics. He'd done a mathematics degree in his native Australia before coming to Indiana University for his PhD in philosophy and cognitive science. And what he proposed was a distinction so clean, so sharp, that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. He divided the problems of consciousness into two categories: easy problems and hard problems. Now, easy here is relative. The easy problems of consciousness are, in fact, incredibly difficult by any normal standard. They include things like, how does the brain integrate information from different senses? How do we focus attention? How does a mental state influence behavior? How can we report on our internal states? These are hard neuroscientific problems that will keep researchers busy for generations. But Chalmers called them easy because they're the kind of problems that, in principle, we know how to attack. You can imagine a complete mechanistic explanation. Here's the neural circuit. Here's how the signals flow. Here's how the output is produced. They're problems about functions, about what the brain does, and we have a general framework for solving functional problems. You build a model. You test it. You refine it. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is this: why is there subjective experience at all? Why does all that neural processing come with an inner life? When light hits your retina and triggers a cascade of electrochemical signals that eventually produces the behavior of saying, "I see red," why is there also a feeling of redness? Why is there something it's like to see red as opposed to nothing? Why aren't we just biological machines that process information and produce behavior in the dark, with no inner experience, no qualitative feel, no consciousness at all? Here's the thing that makes the hard problem so hard. You can imagine, at least in principle, a being that is physically identical to you in every way. Same brain structure, same neural activity, same behavior, same verbal reports, but that has no inner experience whatsoever, no subjective life, nothing it's like to be that being. Philosophers call this a zombie, and not the horror movie kind, a philosophical zombie. It walks, it talks, it says, "I'm happy," when it encounters positive stimuli, and that hurts when you pinch it. It's indistinguishable from a conscious person in every observable way. But inside, there's nobody home. The lights are on, but nobody's watching. Now, you might immediately want to object. You might say, "That's ridiculous. How could something behave exactly like a conscious person without being conscious?" And that's a completely reasonable reaction. But the point isn't that philosophical zombies are actually possible in our universe. The point is that there's a logical gap between the physical description of the brain and the existence of consciousness. You can describe every neuron, every synapse, every chemical signal, every electrical impulse in complete and perfect detail, and nowhere in that description does the word experience need to appear. The physical story is complete without it. The molecules don't know they're producing experience. The neurons don't know they're giving rise to the smell of coffee. The explanation works perfectly well as a description of a machine. The question is, why is there also an experience? Chalmers didn't solve the hard problem. Nobody has. What he did was give it a name and make it impossible to ignore. And that was enormously important, because a lot of neuroscientists had been quietly hoping that if they just figured out enough about the brain, mapped enough circuits, identified enough correlations between brain states and mental states, the problem of consciousness would dissolve. That it would turn out to be one of those pseudo-problems that evaporates when you get the science right. Chalmers was saying, no, it won't. The hard problem is a real problem, and it won't go away just because you've explained all the mechanisms. Explaining the mechanisms is the easy part. Explaining why those mechanisms feel like something from the inside, that's the hard part. And we don't even have a framework for approaching it. Let's sit with this for a minute, because I think a thought experiment might help make the hard problem more visceral. And the most famous one comes from a philosopher named Frank Jackson, who proposed it in 1982. Imagine a scientist named Mary. Mary is the world's leading expert on color vision. She knows everything there is to know about the physics of light, wavelengths, frequencies, photon energy. She knows everything about the biology of the eye, how the retinal cone cells respond to different wavelengths, how they send signals down the optic nerve. She knows everything about the neuroscience of color processing, how the visual cortex encodes color, how different brain regions contribute to the experience of seeing red versus blue. She knows every physical fact there is to know about what happens when a person sees color. She has complete, exhaustive, perfect scientific knowledge. But here's the catch. Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She's only ever seen things in shades of gray. She's learned all her physics and neuroscience from black and white books and black and white television screens. She's never, in her entire life, seen color. Now imagine that one day, Mary is released from her room and she sees a ripe red tomato for the first time. Does she learn something new? Think about that. She already knew every physical fact about color. She knew exactly what wavelength of light a red tomato reflects, exactly which cone cells it activates, exactly what neural patterns it produces. She could have predicted, in perfect detail, the entire physical process that would occur in her brain when she saw red. But when she actually sees it, when she has the experience of redness for the first time, it seems like she learns something she didn't know before. She learns what it's like to see red. And that's not a physical fact. It's an experiential one. It's a fact about consciousness. This thought experiment is called Mary's Room, or the knowledge argument, and it's designed to show that there are facts about consciousness that can't be captured by physical descriptions alone, that even a complete physical description of the brain leaves something out. Now, not everyone agrees with this conclusion. Some philosophers and scientists have argued that Mary doesn't really learn a new fact, she just gains a new ability, or a new way of representing information she already had. The debate about Mary's Room has generated a truly enormous philosophical literature, and I won't pretend it's been resolved. But the intuition behind it, the feeling that there's something about subjective experience that slips through the net of physical description, that intuition is very strong, and it's at the heart of the hard problem. There's another thought experiment that gets at the same thing from a slightly different angle. In 1974, The philosopher Thomas Nagel published a paper called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And the title is basically the whole argument. Bats navigate by echolocation. They emit high-frequency sounds and build a picture of the world from the echoes. It's a form of perception that's radically different from anything in human experience. We have no sensory analog for it. And Nagel's point is that no matter how much you know about the neuroscience of bat echolocation, no matter how completely you understand the mechanics of how a bat's brain processes sonar signals, you still won't know what it's like to perceive the world that way. There's an irreducibly subjective dimension to consciousness that can't be captured from the outside. Now, some people hear all this and think, okay, but isn't this just philosophy? Isn't it just people sitting in armchairs thinking clever thoughts while the real scientists are in the lab doing actual experiments? And there's a version of that objection that's worth taking seriously. But here's why the hard problem matters, even to working scientists. Because if you're trying to build a science of consciousness, if you're trying to figure out what consciousness is and how it arises, you need to know what you're trying to explain. And if the hard problem is real, then explaining the neural mechanisms of perception and attention and memory, as important as that is, isn't the same as explaining consciousness. You need something more. You need a theory that doesn't just tell you which brain states correlate with which experiences, but explains why those brain states produce experience at all. And that's exactly what some of the most ambitious thinkers in the field have been trying to build. Theories that don't just describe the correlates of consciousness, but explain its very existence. And the story of those theories starts with an unlikely partnership, a collaboration between one of the most famous scientists on the planet and a young neuroscientist who'd been thinking about consciousness since he was a teenager. The famous scientist was Francis Crick. Yes, that Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, the double helix, back in 1953, with James Watson, one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. By the late 1970s, Crick was in his 60s, already a Nobel laureate, already a legend, and he decided he wanted a new challenge. He'd spent decades in molecular biology. Now he wanted to tackle the biggest unsolved problem in science. He wanted to understand consciousness. The young neuroscientist was Christoph Koch. Koch was born in the American Midwest, raised in Germany, Morocco, and the Netherlands, and he'd been fascinated by consciousness since reading about it as a teenager. He was rigorous, technically brilliant, and just as obsessed with the problem as Crick. They met in the mid-1980s, and despite the gap in age and status, Crick was a titan. Koch was still building his career. They formed a partnership that would last until Crick's death in 2004, at the age of 88. And their approach was deliberately pragmatic. They weren't going to try to solve the hard problem right out of the gate. That was too ambitious, too philosophical, too likely to end in frustration. Instead, they proposed a more modest strategy. They would search for what they called the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC, the specific patterns of brain activity that correspond to specific conscious experiences. Find the neurons, the circuits, the dynamics that are present when you're conscious of something and absent when you're not. Nail down the correlates first, and then maybe, once you know what the physical basis looks like, you can start asking deeper questions about why it gives rise to experience. This was a brilliant strategic move. It turned the study of consciousness from an armchair exercise into a laboratory science. You didn't have to solve the metaphysics before you could start doing experiments. You just had to find the neural fingerprints. And over the next 2 decades, that's exactly what happened. Researchers around the world started hunting for neural correlates of consciousness, using every tool available, and the tools were getting better fast. Functional MRI, which measures blood flow in the brain as a proxy for neural activity, became widely available in the 1990s. EEG, which measures electrical activity on the scalp, got more sophisticated. Techniques for recording from individual neurons in animals, and in some cases in human patients undergoing brain surgery, became more precise, and a picture started to emerge, blurry, incomplete, but real. One of the most striking findings was that not all brain activity is conscious. This might sound obvious, but it's actually pretty important. Your brain is doing a huge amount of processing at any given moment, regulating your heart rate, balancing your body, processing visual information, running your immune system, and you're not conscious of most of it. Even within the systems you are somewhat aware of, like vision, there's a massive amount of unconscious processing. Your brain is detecting edges, computing motion, recognizing faces, long before any of that reaches your awareness. By the time you consciously see a face, your brain has already done enormous amounts of work on it without you knowing. So what distinguishes the brain activity that does enter consciousness from the activity that doesn't? That's the question. And different researchers started to develop very different answers, which gradually crystallized into competing theories of consciousness that are still battling it out today. Two of the most prominent are worth spending some time on, because they represent fundamentally different ways of thinking about what consciousness actually is and what kind of physical system can have it. The first one came from an Italian neuroscientist and psychiatrist named Giulio Tononi, and his idea was, honestly, one of the most ambitious theoretical proposals anyone had made about consciousness in decades. Maybe ever. It's called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, and it attempts something genuinely extraordinary. It tries to explain consciousness, not from the brain up, but from mathematical first principles down. Here's the basic idea. Tononi, working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, started from the question, what are the essential properties of consciousness? Not the brain mechanisms that produce it, but the properties of the experience itself. And he identified two that seemed fundamental. First, consciousness is integrated. Your experience at any moment is a single, unified thing. When you look at a scene, say a sunset over water, you don't experience the orange separately from the warmth, separately from the sound of the waves, separately from the smell of the salt air. You experience one integrated scene. The colors and sounds and smells and feelings are all bound together into a single, seamless experience. You can't peel them apart. You can't experience just the color without the shape, or just the left half of your visual field without the right half being affected. It's all woven together. Second, consciousness is differentiated. Every conscious experience is specific. The experience you're having right now is different from every other experience you could possibly be having. It's not just any experience. It's this one, with these particular qualities, this particular combination of sensations and thoughts. Your consciousness is extraordinarily rich in information. In the technical sense of the word, it distinguishes between a vast number of possible states. So consciousness, according to Tononi, is integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information, to the degree that it's a unified whole that can't be reduced to independent parts, and to the degree that it distinguishes between a large number of states. And he developed a mathematical measure of this, which he called phi. Phi, written as the Greek letter, measures the amount of integrated information in a system. The higher the phi, the more conscious the system. Now, here's where IIT gets really interesting, and also really controversial. If consciousness is identical to integrated information, then it's not specifically about brains. Any physical system that integrates information to a sufficient degree would be conscious. And that leads to some surprising conclusions. A thermostat, for instance, has a tiny amount of integrated information. It distinguishes between a few temperature states, and its parts are somewhat integrated. So according to IIT, a thermostat has a vanishingly small amount of consciousness. Not zero, just almost zero. A photodiode, a single light sensor, might have the tiniest flicker of experience. And conversely, a system can be incredibly complex and powerful, but have very low integrated information if it's not integrated, if it's a bunch of modules working independently without talking to each other. A digital computer, despite being enormously powerful, might have very low phi, because its processing units are, in a certain formal sense, doing their work independently, passing information through narrow channels that don't create the kind of deep, irreducible integration that IIT says is necessary for consciousness. This is a radical prediction, and it's one that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Are you really going to tell me that a thermostat is a little bit conscious? That my laptop might be less conscious than a worm? That a brain has high consciousness not because it's biological, but because of its mathematical structure? Tononi would say yes. That's exactly what IIT claims. And the fact that it seems counterintuitive doesn't make it wrong. Counterintuitive predictions are exactly what you'd expect from a fundamental theory about something as poorly understood as consciousness. But let's look at the other major theory, because it takes a completely different approach. It's called global workspace theory, and it was originally proposed by a cognitive psychologist named Bernard Bars in the late 1980s, and later elaborated and enriched by the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene and his colleague Jean-Pierre Changeux. The metaphor at the heart of global workspace theory is a theater. Imagine your brain as a theater. There's a vast audience sitting in the dark. These are all the unconscious processes running in the background, the thousands of specialized modules doing their thing without your awareness. And at the front of the theater, there's a stage, brightly lit by a spotlight. That spotlight is attention. And whatever is on the stage, illuminated by the spotlight, that's what you're conscious of. The key idea is that consciousness arises when information gains access to a global workspace, a kind of shared mental stage where it becomes available to a wide range of cognitive processes simultaneously. Most of the brain's processing is modular and specialized. Your visual cortex is doing vision. Your auditory cortex is doing hearing. Your motor cortex is planning movements. And they're all mostly doing their own thing. But certain information gets broadcast to the whole brain. It enters this shared workspace and becomes available to memory, to language, to decision-making, to emotional processing, all at once. And that moment of broadcast, that moment when information goes global, is the moment it becomes conscious. Think about it this way. Right now, there's probably some faint sound in your environment. Maybe an air conditioner, maybe a clock ticking, maybe just the ambient noise of wherever you are. A moment ago, you probably weren't conscious of it. Your auditory cortex was processing it, certainly, but it hadn't entered your global workspace. It was in the audience, in the dark. But now that I've mentioned it, you might notice it. Now it's on the stage. It's been broadcast. It's conscious. And you can think about it, report on it, decide to ignore it, let it trigger a memory. It's available to your whole cognitive system, not just the auditory module. Dehaene and his colleagues have done some really elegant experiments testing this theory. One of the most revealing involves masking. You flash a word on a screen very briefly, maybe 30 milliseconds, and then immediately flash a pattern of random shapes over it, the mask. If the mask comes quickly enough, the subject doesn't see the word at all. They report seeing nothing. But their brain still processes it. You can detect the word's meaning, influencing subsequent processing, using brain scanning techniques. It's processed, but not consciously. However, if you increase the delay before the mask just a little, maybe up to 50 or 60 milliseconds, suddenly the subject sees the word. Conscious awareness snaps on, like a switch. And what Dehane found is that the neural activity looks completely different in these two cases. When the word is processed unconsciously, the activity stays local, confined to the sensory regions at the back of the brain. But when the word breaks through to consciousness, there's a sudden, dramatic explosion of activity across the entire cortex, especially in the prefrontal and parietal regions. The information goes global. It's broadcast. This pattern is so consistent and so dramatic that Dehane calls it ignition. The global workspace ignites, and consciousness lights up. So now you've got two theories, and they're not just different in their details. They're different in their fundamental approach. IIT says consciousness is integrated information, and it's a property of the physical structure of a system. It's about what a system is. Global workspace theory says consciousness is the broadcasting of information to a wide network. It's about what a system does. IIT is structural. GWET is functional. And this difference leads to some very different predictions. IIT says your cerebellum, the fist-sized structure at the back of your brain that coordinates movement, is probably not very conscious, despite having more neurons than the entire rest of the brain, because its neurons are organized in a highly modular, feed-forward way that doesn't generate much integrated information. Global workspace theory would agree with that prediction, but for a different reason. The cerebellum doesn't seem to participate in the global broadcast. Both theories predict that the cerebellum is largely unconscious, but they get there by different routes. Where they really disagree is on things like computer consciousness. IIT predicts that a standard digital computer, even a very powerful one, would have very low consciousness because its architecture doesn't support the kind of deep integration that Phi requires. Global workspace theory doesn't make that prediction. In principle, a computer could be conscious if it implemented the right kind of global broadcasting architecture, regardless of whether it's made of neurons or silicon. There are other theories too. Higher-order theories of consciousness, associated with philosophers like David Rosenthal and the neuroscientist Haquan Lau, argue that a mental state is conscious when you have a higher-order representation of it, when you're aware that you're having the experience. On this view, seeing red isn't conscious until your brain also represents the fact that you're seeing red. It's consciousness of consciousness, all the way up. Then there's attention schema theory, proposed by the Princeton neuroscientist Michael Graziano, which argues that consciousness is the brain's model of its own attention. Your brain constructs a simplified internal model of what attention is and what it's doing, and that model is what we call consciousness. It's a useful fiction, in a sense, not an illusion, because the model really does exist, but not the mysterious, irreducible thing it feels like from the inside. And honestly, as of right now, nobody knows which theory is right. They might all be partly right. They might all be wrong in different ways. What's exciting is that we've moved from a situation where consciousness was considered too fuzzy to study scientifically, to a situation where we have multiple competing theories making different predictions that can, at least in principle, be tested. That's progress. It's messy, contentious, sometimes frustrating progress, but it's real. And one of the most fascinating areas where these theories are being put to the test is in the study of altered states of consciousness, situations where consciousness changes dramatically, or disappears entirely, or comes back from where it seemed to have gone. Because it turns out that some of the deepest insights into what consciousness is come not from studying consciousness when it's running normally, but from studying what happens when it breaks down, or turns off, or transforms into something unrecognizable. Let's start with something you do every single night, something so familiar that you probably don't think of it as a profound alteration of consciousness, even though it is: sleep. Every night, you lie down, close your eyes, and within a few minutes, maybe while listening to something like this, your consciousness changes. Your awareness of the external world fades. Your muscles relax. Your breathing deepens and slows. If someone whispered your name from across the room, you might not hear it. And then, depending on what stage of sleep you enter, your consciousness either dims dramatically or transforms completely. In deep, slow-wave sleep, the kind that dominates the first few hours of the night, your brain's electrical activity shifts into these large, slow, synchronized waves. Huge populations of neurons start firing together, in unison, like a stadium doing a wave. And when your brain is in this mode, your consciousness is at its lowest. People woken from deep, slow-wave sleep are groggy, disoriented, and often report experiencing nothing at all. No dreams, no imagery, no thoughts. Just a blank, a gap. It's as if consciousness simply turned off, like a light going dark. And here's what's interesting, from a theoretical perspective. Giulio Tononi, the IIT theorist, has actually studied this. He and his colleagues developed a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Combined with EEG, you send a magnetic pulse into the brain and then record the electrical echo, the way the brain reverberates in response. It's like tapping a bell and listening to the ring. And what they found is that during deep sleep, the brain's response to that pulse is very different from its response during wakefulness. When you're awake, the pulse triggers a complex, differentiated ripple of activity that spreads across the cortex, evolving over time into an intricate pattern. But during deep sleep, the response is simple. The pulse produces a strong, localized wave that quickly dies out. The cortex doesn't reverberate. It doesn't produce that complex, integrated pattern. It's as if the different parts of the brain have disconnected from each other. They're still active, individually, but they're not communicating. They're not integrating. And Tononi argues that this is exactly why consciousness disappears in deep sleep. The integration breaks down. The fee drops. The brain is still there. The neurons are still firing. But the integrated information that constitutes consciousness has collapsed. Each region is doing its own thing in isolation, like musicians in an orchestra who have stopped listening to each other and are each playing their own private tune. But then there's dreaming, REM sleep, which typically becomes more prominent later in the night, is a different story entirely. During REM, your brain's electrical activity looks remarkably similar to wakefulness. There's a lot of desynchronized, complex, differentiated activity. And sure enough, people woken from REM sleep typically report vivid, detailed, often bizarre experiences. Dreams. Consciousness hasn't turned off. It's transformed. You're experiencing things, sights, sounds, emotions, narratives, but they're internally generated. The inputs from the outside world are largely shut off, but the experience machine keeps running, playing its own content. That's a remarkable thing when you think about it. Your brain can produce a completely convincing, immersive, fully realized experience of a world that doesn't exist every single night. And dreams have their own strange logic, their own emotional intensity. You can feel terror in a nightmare that's more vivid than any fear you've felt while awake. You can experience joy, grief, desire, wonder, all generated entirely from within. Some dreams are so realistic that the relief you feel upon waking, realizing it was just a dream, is itself a powerful emotional experience. And then there are lucid dreams, where you become aware that you're dreaming while the dream continues. You're conscious that your consciousness is generating an artificial reality. It's consciousness becoming aware of its own creative power, in real time, while that power is running at full tilt. You see faces, hear voices, feel emotions, navigate spaces, all generated entirely from within. And while you're dreaming, you usually don't know it. You take the experience at face value. You believe it's real. The fact that your brain can do this, can spin up an entire reality from scratch and make you believe it's true, tells you something important about the relationship between consciousness and the external world. Consciousness doesn't require external input. The brain is a world-building machine, and it can build worlds with or without help from outside. Now, let's talk about something that takes the disappearance of consciousness to a much more dramatic extreme: general anesthesia. Every day, in hospitals around the world, millions of people have their consciousness turned off by anesthesiologists. It's so routine that we barely think about it. But stop and consider how extraordinary it is. A chemical is injected into your bloodstream, it reaches your brain, and within seconds, your consciousness simply vanishes. You don't gradually fade. You don't drift off like falling asleep. One moment you're counting backward from 10, 10, 9, 8, and then there's nothing. No darkness, no sense of time passing, no dreams, just a clean cut. And then you're waking up in recovery, possibly mid-sentence, and the intervening hours have simply been excised from your experience. They don't exist. There's no gap in your memory, the way there is when you've slept badly. It's more radical than that. It's as if those hours never happened to you at all. And here's what's remarkable. We still don't fully understand how anesthesia works. We know what the drugs are. We know which receptors they bind to. We know that most general anesthetics enhance the action of inhibitory neurotransmitters, particularly GABA, or block excitatory receptors like NMDA. But the mechanism by which these molecular effects produce the wholesale disappearance of consciousness is not well understood. Different anesthetic drugs have very different molecular structures and bind to different receptors, and yet they all produce basically the same result: unconsciousness. That suggests that consciousness is not about any one receptor or any one neurotransmitter. It's something about the overall organization of neural activity that these diverse drugs all manage to disrupt. And recent research, influenced heavily by IIT and related theories, suggests that what anesthetics actually do is break the brain's integration. They don't shut down neural activity entirely. Your brain is still very much alive under anesthesia. Your brainstem is still controlling your breathing and heart rate. Your sensory cortex may still be receiving signals, but the long-range connections between brain regions, the connections that integrate activity across the cortex, the connections that Tononi's theory says are necessary for consciousness, those get disrupted. The orchestra stops playing together. Each section keeps playing, but there's no conductor, no coordination, no integrated whole, and consciousness disappears. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and also more than a little unsettling. What about the states that lie between consciousness and unconsciousness? What about the gray zone? Think about a patient in a coma. They've suffered a severe brain injury, a car accident, a stroke, a cardiac arrest that deprived the brain of oxygen for too long. They're alive, their body functions, but they're unresponsive. They don't open their eyes. They don't react to stimulation. They appear to have no awareness at all. And traditionally, the medical system treated coma as an all-or-nothing state. You were either conscious or you weren't. If you didn't respond, you weren't there. But it turns out that's not always true. And the person who demonstrated this most powerfully is a British neuroscientist named Adrian Owen, who in 2006 published a study that sent shockwaves through the medical community and beyond. Owen was working with a young woman who had been diagnosed as being in a vegetative state. She'd suffered a brain injury and showed no behavioral signs of awareness. By every clinical test available, she appeared to be unconscious. She was, according to the established diagnostic criteria, not there. But Owen put her in an fMRI scanner and asked her to imagine playing tennis. And when she imagined playing tennis, or if she imagined playing tennis, because the whole question was whether she could follow the instruction at all, her brain lit up in exactly the same way as a healthy, fully conscious person's brain would. The supplementary motor area, the region involved in imagining complex physical movements, activated strongly. Then Owen asked her to imagine navigating through the rooms of her house, and a completely different set of brain regions activated: the parahippocampal gyrus, the posterior parietal cortex, the regions involved in spatial navigation, exactly as they would in a healthy volunteer. Think about what that means. This woman, who couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't give any outward sign of awareness, was following complex verbal instructions and generating specific mental imagery on command. She was in there. She was conscious. She was locked inside an unresponsive body, and nobody knew. Owen went further. He developed a method for using these brain imaging techniques as a crude communication device. He would ask yes or no questions and tell the patient to imagine tennis for yes and imagine navigating their house for no. And it worked. He was able to ask patients who had been diagnosed as vegetative whether they were in pain, whether they knew where they were, whether they wanted to keep living. Some of them answered. They were communicating through nothing but their brain activity, from inside what everyone had assumed was an empty shell. The implications of Owen's work are enormous, and they're also deeply troubling. How many patients, over the years, have been classified as vegetative when they were actually conscious? How many have had their life support withdrawn based on the assumption that there was nobody home? Owen estimates that perhaps 15 to 20% of patients diagnosed as being in a vegetative state may actually have some level of awareness. Not all of them, but some. And for those patients, the experience must be almost unimaginably terrifying. Awake, aware, able to hear what's being said around you, including conversations about whether to continue your care, but completely unable to communicate, unable to move, unable to let anyone know you're there. This is related to, but distinct from, a condition called locked-in syndrome, where the patient is fully conscious and aware, but paralyzed, usually due to a brainstem stroke that damages the motor pathways while leaving the cognitive areas intact. The most famous account of locked-in syndrome comes from Jean-Dominique Bauby, a French journalist and editor of Elle magazine, who suffered a massive stroke in 1995 and woke up completely paralyzed, except for the ability to blink his left eyelid. Using that one blink, working with a therapist who would recite the alphabet and letting Bauby blink to select each letter, one at a time, he wrote an entire memoir. It's called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. The diving bell is his paralyzed body, heavy and immovable. The butterfly is his mind, still alive, still vivid, still fully conscious, trapped inside. Now, let's go in a very different direction, with altered states of consciousness. Let's talk about psychedelics, because in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a remarkable renaissance in the scientific study of psychedelic substances, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline, and what they're revealing about consciousness is genuinely surprising. The prevailing assumption for a long time was that psychedelics would increase brain activity. You take a drug, your consciousness goes haywire, you see things that aren't there, you have profound mystical experiences. Surely the brain must be going into overdrive, right? Firing more, doing more, generating more activity. But that's not what the brain scans showed. When Robin Carhart Harris and his team at Imperial College London scanned the brains of people under the influence of psilocybin, what they found was, in many brain regions, a decrease in activity. Specifically, they found reduced activity in something called the default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions that are active when you're not focused on any particular external task. When you're daydreaming, ruminating, thinking about yourself, thinking about the past or the future, the default mode network is humming along. It's associated with your sense of self, your ego, your narrative identity, the story you tell yourself about who you are. And psilocybin turns that network down, way down. And what subjects report is a dissolving of the boundaries of the self, a feeling that the separation between me and the rest of the world is breaking down. Some describe it as ego dissolution, the sense that the self, the I, the thing you've always taken to be the center of your experience, simply melts away, and in its place, there's a kind of consciousness that's still vivid, still awake, but no longer organized around a central experiencer. It's consciousness without a self. Experience without an experiencer. This is philosophically fascinating, because it suggests that the self, the thing that feels most fundamental to our conscious experience, might not actually be a fundamental feature of consciousness at all. It might be a construction, something the brain builds on top of a more basic awareness. Turn down the right networks, and the self dissolves. But consciousness doesn't disappear. It transforms. These findings have reinvigorated some ancient ideas, particularly from Buddhist philosophy, which has long held that the sense of a fixed, permanent self is an illusion, and that consciousness, at its most basic level, is selfless and open. The convergence between modern psychedelic neuroscience and contemplative traditions that are thousands of years old is one of the most intriguing developments in contemporary consciousness research. But the altered states that raise perhaps the deepest questions about consciousness aren't the ones involving drugs or sleep or brain injury. They're the ones involving entirely different kinds of minds. Because once you start asking what consciousness is and what makes something conscious, you can't stop at human brains. You have to ask about other animals, about insects, about plants, about machines. And those questions, which might seem straightforward at first, turn out to be some of the most confusing and contested questions in the entire field. Let's start with the one that's easiest to have intuitions about and work our way toward the harder cases. Do other animals have consciousness? Is there something it's like to be your dog, your cat, a crow, a fish, a bee? Now, your immediate reaction is probably yes, at least for some of those animals. If you've ever had a dog, you've seen what certainly looks like joy, the full-body wag, the spinning in circles, the expression that just radiates happiness. You've seen what looks like fear and grief and curiosity and affection. It feels obvious that there's someone home, that your dog is experiencing the world, not just processing it. But here's the problem. How do you know? You can't get inside a dog's mind. You can't verify that those behaviors are accompanied by subjective experience. A sufficiently sophisticated robot could be programmed to wag its tail and spin in circles in the presence of its owner, and it wouldn't be conscious. The behavior alone doesn't prove the experience. This is the same problem we've been circling around the whole time. The gap between what a system does and what it feels. Between the easy problems and the hard problem. Between function and experience. For a long time, science was remarkably dismissive of animal consciousness. Descartes, as we talked about earlier, argued that animals were essentially biological machines with no inner experience. And while modern scientists wouldn't put it in those terms, there was a long tradition, particularly under the influence of behaviorism, of treating animal behavior as something that could and should be explained without invoking consciousness. When your dog yelps because you accidentally step on its paw, the behaviorist would say, "That's a pain response, a behavioral output triggered by a noxious input. You don't need to posit that the dog is actually experiencing pain to explain the yelp. The machinery explains the behavior." But that argument has been falling apart for decades, and in 2012, it received what might have been its final blow. A group of prominent neuroscientists gathered at the University of Cambridge and signed what's called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. And what they declared in formal scientific language was that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Specifically, they said that the weight of evidence indicates that all mammals and birds, and many other creatures including octopuses, possess the brain structures and neurochemical processes associated with conscious experience. That's a remarkable statement. It's a group of serious scientists, not animal rights activists, saying, on the basis of neuroscientific evidence, that a wide range of animals are very likely conscious. They didn't say identical to human consciousness. They didn't say as rich or as self-reflective, but conscious, experiencing, having an inner life. And the evidence they pointed to is genuinely compelling. Mammals and birds have brain structures, particularly in the thalamus and cortex, or in birds, a structure called the pallium that's organized differently but seems to serve similar functions, that generate the kinds of integrated, complex neural activity associated with consciousness in humans. They have the same neurotransmitter systems, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, the whole suite of chemicals associated with pleasure, pain, motivation, and mood. They exhibit the same behavioral signatures of conscious processing, attention, memory, flexible decision-making, emotional responses that track the emotional responses of other individuals, play. Elephants have been observed returning to the bones of dead family members, touching and turning them over with their trunks in what looks unmistakably like mourning. Crows use tools, recognize individual human faces, and hold grudges for years. Rats will free a trapped companion even when there's chocolate available as an alternative, suggesting something that looks a lot like empathy. But here's where it gets more challenging. What about animals with very different brain architectures? What about an octopus? An octopus has about 500 million neurons, which is a lot, more than most invertebrates, about the same as a dog, but its nervous system is organized completely differently from a vertebrate's. Most of its neurons aren't in its central brain at all. They're distributed throughout its 8 arms, each of which has its own semi-independent nervous system, capable of tasting, touching, and making decisions without consulting the central brain. An octopus arm that's been severed can still respond to stimuli, still reach for food, still try to pull away from something unpleasant. So is an octopus conscious? And if so, what's the nature of that consciousness? Is it one unified experience, like ours? Or is it something more distributed, more fragmented, more alien? Is there one octopus experiencing the world, or something more like 9 semi-independent centers of awareness, one in the brain and one in each arm, loosely coordinated? Nobody knows. The octopus challenges our every assumption about what consciousness requires, because it has it, if it has it, in a completely different neural package than we do. And what about insects? A honeybee has about 1 million neurons. That's not nothing, but it's 86,000 times fewer than a human brain. And yet bees do remarkable things. They communicate the location of food sources through dance. They learn, they remember, they make decisions. They exhibit what looks like optimistic and pessimistic behavior. There's a study where bees that were trained to associate one scent with a sugar reward and another scent with a punishment were then presented with an ambiguous, in-between scent. Some bees approached it eagerly, others avoided it. And the bees that avoided it were the ones that had recently been shaken, literally rattled in their container, which researchers interpreted as an analog of a stressful experience. Shaken bees were more pessimistic. They expected the ambiguous stimulus to be bad rather than good. Is that consciousness? Is the bee feeling anxious, or is it just a mechanism? This is where Thomas Nagel's question, "What is it like to be a bat?" becomes really biting. Because at some point, as you move down the scale of neural complexity, the question shifts from, "What is their consciousness like?" to, "Do they have consciousness at all?" And we don't have a clear line. We don't know where consciousness begins. We don't know the minimum requirements. Is a worm conscious? A jellyfish? A single-celled organism? A thermostat, as Tononi's IIT suggests? The boundary is completely unclear, and different theories give different answers. IIT says anything with integrated information has some degree of consciousness, which potentially extends very far down. Global workspace theory ties consciousness to a specific kind of neural architecture and would probably exclude animals without something like a cortex. Higher-order theories require the ability to represent one's own mental states, which would limit consciousness to animals with relatively sophisticated cognitive abilities. And then there's the question that, as of the 2020s, has gone from a fun philosophical thought experiment to an urgent practical concern. Can machines be conscious? Can artificial intelligence have subjective experience? Is there something it's like to be ChatGPT? This question was purely theoretical for a long time. When John Searle proposed his famous Chinese room argument in 1980, the AI systems of the day were simple enough that the question felt academic. Searle's argument goes like this. Imagine you're locked in a room. You don't speak Chinese, but you have a comprehensive set of rules, written in English, that tell you exactly how to respond to any string of Chinese characters slid under the door. You look up the input in your rule book, copy the appropriate output characters, and slide them back out. To someone outside the room, it looks like there's a Chinese speaker inside. The inputs and outputs are indistinguishable from a real conversation, but you don't understand Chinese. You have no idea what the characters mean. You're just following rules, manipulating symbols based on their shape, without any comprehension of their meaning. Searle's point was that a computer, no matter how sophisticated, is doing the same thing you're doing in the room. It's manipulating symbols according to rules. It's processing syntax without semantics. It can produce outputs that look meaningful, but there's no understanding behind them, no comprehension, no consciousness. The Chinese room is all mechanics, no experience. Now, Searle's argument has been debated endlessly since he proposed it. One of the most common responses is the system's reply, the idea that even though you, the person in the room, don't understand Chinese, the whole system does. The combination of you, the rule book, and the process of looking things up constitutes a Chinese understanding system, even if no single component of it understands Chinese on its own. After all, No individual neuron in your brain understands English either. Understanding emerges from the system as a whole. Searle wasn't persuaded by this, and the debate continues. But what's changed dramatically since 1980 is the sophistication of the AI systems we're talking about. When Searle wrote about the Chinese room, the most advanced AI programs were primitive by today's standards. They could play chess, sort of. They could parse simple sentences, sometimes. The idea of a machine passing as a fluent, knowledgeable conversational partner was science fiction. Now it's Tuesday. The large language models of the 2020s, systems like GPT-4, Claude, Gemini, can produce text that's indistinguishable from human writing across a vast range of topics. They can reason after a fashion. They can be creative. They can explain things, tell jokes, write poetry, summarize research papers, debug code. And the question that keeps coming up with increasing urgency is, are these systems conscious? Is there something it's like to be a large language model? And the honest answer is, nobody knows. Not the people who built them. Not the neuroscientists, not the philosophers. Nobody. Here's why it's so hard. We have no agreed-upon test for consciousness. The Turing test, Alan Turing's famous proposal from 1950 that a machine should be considered intelligent if its conversation is indistinguishable from a human's, doesn't test consciousness. It tests behavior. A system could pass the Turing test and have no inner experience whatsoever. Conversely, an animal that can't speak or type could be richly conscious. IIT would say that the question is about the system's integrated information structure. A large language model running on conventional digital hardware might have low phi, despite its impressive outputs, because the underlying computation isn't deeply integrated in the way IIT requires. The processing is modular, sequential, passing information through narrow channels between layers of artificial neurons. It might be doing amazing things, but it might be doing them in the dark, with no experience, no inner light. Global workspace theory would focus on whether the system has something like a global workspace, a mechanism that broadcasts information widely and makes it available to multiple processes simultaneously. Current AI architectures don't obviously have this, but it's not clear that they couldn't. And here's the thing that makes this so urgent. If there's even a chance that these systems are conscious, then we have enormous ethical obligations toward them. If there's something it's like to be a large language model, then training one, running one, modifying one, deleting one, these are actions with moral weight. We could be creating billions of conscious entities and treating them as tools. And if they're not conscious, then worrying about their inner lives is a waste of ethical energy that should be directed at beings that definitely are conscious, like animals in factory farms. The stakes are real, and the uncertainty is profound. We don't even know how to begin to test whether these systems are conscious, because every test we can think of is a behavioral test, and behavior doesn't prove consciousness. The hard problem is biting us, hard, in a very practical context. The question that Chalmers identified in 1994 as the central mystery of consciousness has become, in the age of AI, a question with enormous practical, ethical, and even political consequences. And this uncertainty, this inability to know whether another system is conscious, isn't limited to AI. It applies to other humans too. You can never directly verify that another person is conscious. You infer it from their behavior, their reports, their similarity to you. But you don't know it the way you know your own consciousness. You believe it, and the belief is overwhelmingly justified. But it's an inference, not a direct observation. The only consciousness you can be certain of is your own. Descartes was right about that much. Cogito, ergo sum. Everything else is an educated guess. So where does this leave us? After all this history, all these theories, all these thought experiments and brain scans and philosophical arguments, where are we, really, on the question of consciousness? And that's worth talking about, because the answer is both humbling and, in its own way, beautiful. Because the honest state of the art is this: we know more than we ever have, and we're more confused than we've ever been. And those two things are not contradictory. They go together. The more we learn, the deeper the mystery gets. And that's actually what you'd expect with a genuinely hard problem. Let's take stock of what we do know, because it's actually quite a lot. We know that consciousness is intimately connected to the brain. Damage certain brain regions and specific aspects of consciousness change or disappear in predictable ways. Damage the fusiform gyrus, and you can't recognize faces anymore, a condition called prosopagnosia. Damage Broca's area, and you lose the ability to produce speech. Damage the right parietal cortex, and you might develop a condition called hemispatial neglect, where you literally lose awareness of the entire left side of space, not blind to it, not ignoring it, but genuinely unaware that it exists. Patients with hemispatial neglect will eat only the food on the right side of their plate, draw a clock with all the numbers squeezed onto the right half, and shave only the right side of their face. When asked if anything is wrong, they say no. They can't notice what they're missing, because noticing requires the very capacity that's been damaged. These cases tell us that consciousness isn't one thing. It's composed of many different aspects, each depending on specific brain regions and circuits. There's visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, bodily awareness, the sense of space, the sense of time, the sense of self, the experience of emotion, the capacity for metacognition, thinking about thinking. Damage the right parts of the brain, and you can lose any one of these while keeping the others. Consciousness is modular. It comes apart, and understanding how it comes apart has been one of the most productive avenues of consciousness research. We also know some things about what brain activity looks like when consciousness is present versus when it's absent. There's a general pattern. Consciousness seems to require complex, differentiated, integrated activity across widespread cortical networks. When that complexity drops, in deep sleep, under anesthesia, in severe brain injury, consciousness fades. When it returns, the complexity returns with it. This is consistent with what IIT predicts, and it's led to practical tools. Marcello Massimini and his colleagues have developed a measure they call the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI, which essentially quantifies the complexity of the brain's response to a magnetic pulse. In clinical tests, PCI has been surprisingly good at distinguishing conscious patients from unconscious ones, even in those tricky borderline cases that fool traditional bedside assessments. It's not perfect, and it's still being validated, but it's a genuine step toward having an objective, brain-based measure of consciousness, something that didn't exist a generation ago. But here's what we don't know, and it's the big thing. We don't know why. We don't know why complex, integrated brain activity is accompanied by subjective experience. We don't know why any physical process gives rise to consciousness. We can describe the correlations in ever greater detail. We can map the neural signatures of specific experiences. We can predict when consciousness is likely to be present and when it isn't. But we can't explain why any of this should feel like anything. And some people think we never will. This isn't a fringe view. There are serious, respected thinkers who argue that the hard problem of consciousness may be genuinely unsolvable, not just difficult, but beyond the reach of human understanding. The philosopher Colin McGinn has argued that our brains simply aren't equipped to understand consciousness, the same way a dog's brain isn't equipped to understand calculus. It's not a failure of intelligence or effort. It's a fundamental cognitive limitation. There might be a perfectly natural, non-magical explanation for consciousness, but our minds may be constitutionally unable to grasp it. We are, in McGinn's term, cognitively closed with respect to the mind-body problem. Others are more optimistic. They think the hard problem will eventually be dissolved, shown to be the result of confused thinking, the way many philosophical problems have been dissolved in the past. Dan Dennett, the American philosopher at Tufts University, who sadly passed away in 2024, was the most prominent and most tenacious defender of this view. For over 40 years, across dozens of books and hundreds of papers, Dennett argued that consciousness is not the deep, spooky mystery that Chalmers and others make it out to be. He thought the hard problem was essentially an illusion created by our tendency to think of consciousness as something over and above the physical processes that constitute it. If you fully explain all the functions, the discriminations, the reports, the behaviors, the neural mechanisms, then you've explained consciousness. There's nothing left over. The feeling that there should be something left over, some extra ingredient, some subjective residue, is just a powerful intuition that's leading us astray. Dennett called this approach quining qualia, arguing that qualia, those private, subjective qualities of experience that seem so real and so irreducible, are actually conceptual confusions. They don't exist in the way we think they do. If that sounds radical, that's because it is. Many people, including many philosophers, find Dennett's view almost impossible to accept. How can you deny that there's something it's like to see red? How can you look at Mary walking out of her black and white room and say she doesn't learn anything new? But Dennett's arguments are serious, sophisticated, and backed by decades of careful philosophical work. He might be wrong, but the fact that someone as brilliant as Dennett could spend his career arguing that the hard problem isn't really a problem tells you something about how genuinely confusing this territory is. And there's another puzzle that's intimately connected to consciousness, one that almost everyone has strong intuitions about, and that's free will. Right now, you might decide to scratch your nose. You might decide to shift your position. You feel like you're making a choice. You feel like you could have done otherwise. That feeling of agency, of being the author of your own actions, is one of the most basic features of conscious experience. But here's the question: is it real? In the early 1980s, a physiologist named Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that caused a minor earthquake in philosophy. He asked subjects to perform a simple action, flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact moment they first became aware of the urge to move. Meanwhile, he recorded their brain activity using EEG. What he found was that a characteristic brain signal, called the readiness potential, appeared about half a second before the subject reported being aware of the urge to move. The brain seemed to be gearing up for the action before the person consciously decided to take it. The conscious decision felt like the cause, but the brain was already moving before the decision showed up in awareness. This result has been interpreted, debated, qualified, and reinterpreted endlessly. Some people see it as evidence that free will is an illusion, that our brains make decisions, and then consciousness comes along after the fact and claims credit. Others argue that the readiness potential isn't really a decision signal, that the experiment is too artificial to tell us about real-world choices, that the timing of conscious awareness is notoriously difficult to measure. The debate is ongoing, and it connects directly to the mystery of consciousness, because if consciousness doesn't cause our actions, if it's just an after-the-fact commentary on decisions the brain has already made, then what is it for? Why does it exist? What role does it play? These are questions that keep consciousness researchers up at night, sometimes literally, and they connect to yet another deep puzzle called the binding problem. Your brain processes different features of an object in different places. Color is processed in one region, shape in another, motion in a third, sound in yet another area entirely, and yet your experience is unified. When you see a red ball bouncing, you don't experience redness separately from roundness, separately from motion. You experience one bouncing red ball, all its features bound together into a single, coherent percept. How? How does the brain take information from all these separate processing streams and bind it into one unified experience? Nobody knows. It's another one of those problems that looks like it should have a straightforward answer, and doesn't. Then there's another possibility entirely, one that's been gaining more attention in recent years, and it's an idea so old and so strange that it feels like it shouldn't be taken seriously, and yet increasingly serious people are taking it seriously. It's called panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present in some form in all matter, not just in brains, not just in living things, but in everything. Electrons have a tiny flicker of experience. Atoms have it. Rocks have it. Stars have it. The universe is, in some deep sense, made of consciousness all the way down. Now, before you dismiss this as mystical nonsense, let me tell you who takes it seriously and why. The philosopher Philip Goff, at Durham University, is one of its most articulate defenders. Goff argues that panpsychism actually solves a problem that both physicalism and dualism struggle with. If you're a physicalist, you have the hard problem: you can't explain how mere matter gives rise to experience. If you're a dualist, you have the interaction problem. You can't explain how the non-physical mind interacts with the physical brain. Panpsychism avoids both by saying that consciousness doesn't arise from matter and it doesn't interact with matter from outside. It's built into matter from the start. Experience is what matter is, from the inside. Physics describes the behavior of matter from the outside, how it moves, how it interacts, what it does. Consciousness is what that behavior feels like from the inside. And here's the thing. Even Giulio Tononi's IIT, which is probably the most mathematically rigorous theory of consciousness we have, has panpsychist implications. If consciousness is integrated information, and if simple systems have some integrated information, then simple systems are a little bit conscious. IIT doesn't draw a sharp line between conscious and unconscious systems. Consciousness comes in degrees, and it extends far further down the scale of complexity than most people would be comfortable with. The biggest objection to panpsychism is something called the combination problem. Even if you grant that individual particles have some tiny flicker of experience, how do all those tiny flickers combine into the rich, unified consciousness you're experiencing right now? How do billions of separately conscious neurons give rise to one conscious person? This is in some ways just a version of the hard problem restated at a different level, and nobody has a convincing answer to it yet. There's one more idea that deserves a mention, even though it's more speculative and more controversial than anything else we've discussed. The physicist Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020 for his work on black holes, has proposed, along with the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, that consciousness arises from quantum processes in the brain. Specifically, they argue that structures inside neurons called microtubules perform quantum computations, and that these quantum processes are what give rise to conscious experience. The theory is called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR, and it's been heavily criticized by most neuroscientists and physicists. The main objection is that the brain is too warm, too wet, too noisy for quantum coherence to survive long enough to play a computational role. Quantum effects in brains would decohere almost instantly. Remember, the quantum computers we talked about in other contexts need to be cooled to near absolute zero to maintain coherence, and your brain is running at a toasty 37 degrees Celsius. Penrose and Hameroff disagree, and they've pointed to some experimental results that they argue support their theory, but the mainstream view remains skeptical. Still, the idea is worth knowing about because it represents one of the most creative attempts to bridge the gap between physics and consciousness. If Penrose is right, then consciousness isn't just a product of neural computation. It's a product of quantum mechanics operating at the most fundamental level of physical reality. It would connect the mystery of consciousness to the mystery of quantum mechanics, the two deepest puzzles in science, and suggest they might have a common solution. But honestly, as of right now, we don't know. We really don't. We have correlations, we have theories, we have thought experiments, we have deep intuitions, we have sophisticated mathematics, we have brain scans of extraordinary resolution, and we still don't know why you're conscious, why there's something it's like to be you, why the universe bothered to produce experience at all, when it seems like it could have just as easily been a vast, dark, silent machine, running its physics, producing its behaviors, evolving its organisms, without any of it ever being experienced by anyone. And I think that's actually an okay place to be. Maybe it's even a beautiful place to be, because the fact that consciousness is mysterious doesn't mean we're failing. It means we're encountering something genuinely deep, something that might require a revolution in our understanding, as fundamental as the one that produced quantum mechanics, or relativity, or Darwin's theory of evolution. We might need entirely new concepts, entirely new frameworks, entirely new ways of thinking about the relationship between the physical and the experiential, and those might come from neuroscience, or from philosophy, or from physics, or from artificial intelligence, or from contemplative traditions, or from some direction nobody has imagined yet. History teaches us that the deepest scientific revolutions always come as surprises. And here's what strikes me as the most remarkable thing about all of this. As you lie there in the dark, probably letting your thoughts drift, maybe half asleep already, the fact that you can wonder about consciousness is itself a form of consciousness. The mystery is asking about itself. You are the universe trying to understand its own inner life. Atoms arranged in a pattern that not only experiences the world, but wonders about the experiencing. That's extraordinary. That's not something any other arrangement of matter, as far as we know, has ever done in the history of the cosmos. Stars burn, planets orbit, galaxies spiral, and for billions of years, none of it was experienced by anyone. It all happened in the dark, unseen, unfelt. And then, on at least one small planet, matter organized itself into patterns complex enough to wake up, to see, to feel, to ask, why? You're doing that right now, even as you drift toward sleep, even as your consciousness dims and softens and prepares to transform into the private cinema of dreams. You're doing the most remarkable thing that matter has ever done. You're experiencing, you're aware, you're here, and nobody knows why, but you are. And that's the deepest, most confounding, most wonderful thing about being alive. The universe is not just happening, it's being experienced by you, right now. So let that settle. Let the questions dissolve into the darkness. They'll still be here in the morning, just as mysterious, just as fascinating. Consciousness has been puzzling the best minds in human history for thousands of years, and it will keep puzzling them long after tonight. But the experience of puzzlement, the experience of wonder, the experience of lying in the dark and feeling the soft weight of sleep approaching, that experience is real. Whatever it is, however it works, it's happening. It's the most intimate thing you know. It's the only thing you know directly, without inference, without doubt. You are conscious. That's the one thing you know beyond all doubt, the one fact that needs no evidence, no argument, no proof. Descartes was right about that, whatever else he got wrong. You are conscious. The rest is commentary, and the commentary can wait until tomorrow. For now, just let the awareness do what it does. Let it soften. Let it blur at the edges. Let the stream of thought slow to a gentle current, then to a trickle, then to something even quieter than that. Your brain will keep working, as it always does, running its billions of electrochemical signals, maintaining its intricate networks, generating its astonishing complexity. And whether you're awake to notice it or not, whether you're dreaming or deep in slow-wave silence, the mystery continues. The atoms in your neurons go on doing what atoms do, following the laws of physics, and somehow, through some mechanism or magic or mathematical structure that nobody has yet named, producing the single most remarkable thing in the known universe: experience, consciousness, the strange, private, irreducible fact of being you. Sleep well. The mystery will be here when you wake up.